Assalamu alaikum everybody. So this is peace multilateralism in the UN, and today's lecture is going to be the last lecture for this semester. The last readings based lecture for this semester. I'll explain on Wednesday what we're going to do on week 17. So today we're basically going to be going over the very broad question of the future of the UN, and then we'll also zone in on the future of the UN given the coronavirus situation. Before we go ahead, I have some prompts for your response paper if you're planning to write one this week. The first one is, has the UN as a representation of the collective security institution been successful? So in order to answer this, you'll have to obviously come up with a criteria based on the basis of which you'll be measuring the success or lack thereof of the UN. And for that criteria, if you remember a couple of weeks ago, we had one lecture where we laid out quite an extensive criteria, and then we'll also be discussing some key factors or key points to consider for evaluation in this lecture. So make sure that if you answer this question, that you also frame it within a certain criteria, right? Because on the basis of what wala question answer ho jana chahiye. Second one is, what criteria would you apply if you were to evaluate the success of the UN? So in some ways it is similar to the first question, but the second one asks for more creativity on your part to define a certain evaluation criteria, so you're not just limited to the criteria that's already been presented, but you can also be more analytical and be more creative in the second question. And then the final one is the developing world or the global south going to remain locked in terms of the challenges they face at the global stage? So locked in, what do I mean by that? It somehow goes back to the point about the dependency theory that we discussed earlier on in this course, that essentially between the center and the periphery there's going to be constant dependence, right? So essentially this question asks you to mull over that point a little bit more and to answer whether or not you think that the developing world is going to remain in that position in the periphery. Essentially, is it going to remain dependent on the center for, let's say, security, for development, and for all other things? So it's not necessary कि आप इन तीनों में से कोई response paper prompt choose करें. You can also respond to any one of the readings in particular, but I do think in say if you pick one of these, that would also be very interesting to look at. And then obviously there will be a final response paper prompt which would be based on the very final slide on this presentation. I'll upload the slides on LMS as well. So the first thing that we have to consider is the question, can institutions cause peace? Now we're not really looking at any form of correlation between institutions and peace. We're not looking at whether the presence of institutions helps peace, but we're asking a very specific question. We're asking, can institutions cause peace? Right? Cause peace at the global level or even like in certain conflict areas. So Mearsheimer, while reading, Mearsheimer concludes that institutions have minimal influence on state behavior and therefore they hold little promise for promoting stability in the post-Cold War world. Now one thing to consider is that this was written in 1994, right? So whether or not this still stands true is open for debate. But what Mearsheimer does point out, and I think rightly so, is that over the course of the last 16 weeks, we've discussed how state sovereignty is somehow always upheld, right? It's always taken the higher priority compared with globalism or just compared with cosmopolitanism, and that's part of the reason why the UN faces certain challenges. So institutions when they have minimal influence on state behavior, right? So they can think about the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's mostly aspirational. It can say, it can, it's not binding, right? So when states sign it, they sort of make a very flimsy promise to follow that declaration, but since they're not accountable to, since they're not bound to follow it, then they're not going to really take it as seriously as they would if they were going to be, if there was a possibility of them being held accountable for their actions. So we do understand that institutions, they do have very little influence on state behavior. And when they have little influence on, how the states can behave, it means that they cannot really promise stability or peace in the post-Cold War world. And post-Cold War world, why? Because he's writing at a time of, this is like the main point of discussion around the early 1990s. Now, Mearsheimer, he looked at liberal institutionalism, he looked at collective security, and he also looked at critical theory to reach the above conclusion, right? So this conclusion is not just put out there because this is what he personally believes, but because he's looked at three different institutions, three different views, and then he's reached the above conclusion. Collective security is going to be of the most interest to us. So we'll go to that after we discuss the other two, after we discuss liberal institutionalism and critical theory. But before that, we need to also understand, or we also need to come to the same page, be on the same page about what institutions are. Mearsheimer defines institutions as a set of rules that stipulate the ways in which states should cooperate and compete with each other, right? So it's not, जैसे हमने शुरू में भी जैसे हमने शुरू में डिस्कस किया हुआ है, right, about like organizations versus institutions. That institutions is more like a set of rules that dictate, or that sort of, present that this is how things should be done, versus organizations which are sort of the physical manifestation of those rules. So institutions similarly are defined by Mearsheimer as a set of rules that stipulate the ways in which states should cooperate and compete with each other. These rules are typically formalized in international agreements, as we've seen, and are usually embodied in organizations with their own personnel and budgets, right? So set of rules, and then you get that to the international community, you get them to sign on it, to sign an agreement that they're going to follow the set of rules, and then they're embodied in institutions, or in organizations, and in how they organize those organizations, essentially. So institutions are arenas for acting out power relationships. That's one big assertion, or one big argument that Mearsheimer makes. Do you agree with this idea that institutions are spaces for acting out power relationships? And if so, then how, right? So institutions, when we say that they are essentially a set of rules, it means कि वो rules कहाँ से आए हैं, right? What happens in the background before these rules are established? So that's where the power play comes in. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on what you think about this particular assertion. एक realist worldview आ जाता है, where the central tenet, and we've discussed this before, so I'll just quickly go over it. The key feature here is that states are both offensively oriented and they're defensively oriented, right? So again, it's all very state-centric, essentially. And it sees states as super competitive, which is why they're also offensively and defensively oriented. Emphasis is on the idea of relative gains. Now this is very interesting, right? So basically the super competitiveness that states exist within the realist worldview, relative gains are of the utmost importance. So for example, a state would say that mera gain is good, obviously, but then my gain compared with someone else's loss is even better, right? So, and as a state, you would want to go for the better option, and in this case, the better option is the one where your gain is in addition to someone else's loss, right? So then that gives you more power, that gives you a higher stature essentially. You come out as a considerable or a real winner in a way. And that's like a brief view of the realist worldview that Mearsheimer presents. So earlier we talked about liberal institutionalism and critical theory and collective security. So these are three things that Mearsheimer looked at before coming to the conclusion that institutions cannot necessarily cause peace. So liberal institutionalism can the focus is on explaining why economic and environmental cooperation among states is more likely than realists recognize it, because the realists talk about competition, the realists talk about relative gain, but to liberal institutionalists, and they talk about cooperation is likely, it's not impossible. Increased cooperation in those realms is presumed to reduce the likelihood of war, although liberal institutionalists do not explain how. Now the interesting thing about liberal institutionalism, according to Mearsheimer, is that they do believe that cooperation is possible, but and then they also believe that such cooperation is likely to prevent war, or it reduces the likelihood of war, but they don't explain the how, right? And that's something that goes against their case in a way, because the relationship between more cooperation and reduced likelihood of war is not really explained. So then that's all up in the air, and that sort of makes them lose their credibility. Not credibility, but just like it makes them slightly less believable. Then we have critical theory, which aims to transform the fundamental nature of international politics and to create a world where there is not just increased cooperation among states, but the possibility of genuine peace. So this is more transformation. It looks at radical change, right? It looks at radical shifts in how international politics are basically structured, and it looks at it aims to create a world where there is increased cooperation, and then there's also the possibility of genuine peace. Again, it's much a relationship between increased cooperation and the possibility of genuine peace. Like the how is not answered. So what these two things are missing is the how. The how of the relationship between cooperation on the one hand and peace or reduced likelihood of war. Now this box here is something that's not really been explained as well, right? So ye cheez missing hai, and when this connection is missing, then it becomes more difficult to adhere to these two views. Then we come to collective security. Collective security assumes that force will continue to matter in world politics, and that states will have to guard against potential aggressors. The threat of war can be greatly reduced by challenging realist thinking about state behavior and substituting in its place three anti-realist norms. So this goes in direct opposition to the realist view, right? So we have the verses. So going against that, it says that force will continue to matter and states will have to guard themselves, but state behavior according to the realist school is not really as solid as the realists would believe, that it can be challenged, and you can have three norms replace the realist view of state behavior. उसमें एक क्या आ जाता है कि collective rejection of the use of force, even though it is assuming that force will continue to matter in world politics. But at the same time, if there's a collective rejection of the use of force, so collective rejection means that all states would have to collectively reject the use of force or promise that they won't resort to the use of force, which is very difficult to achieve. Second क्या है कि joining against aggressors to show force. Now again, this goes against point one in some ways, right? So this is a bit counterintuitive in a way. But anyway, so the second point is joining against aggressors to show force, and then thirdly, building trust among states. Right? So building trust among states is, I think, the most important of these if you want to go against the state behavior, like the individualism that's purported by the realist school of thought. But then again, building trust among states, how do you build trust among states? एक तो ये हो सकता है कि you collectively reject the use of force, right? So that would help build trust among states. But then again, how sustainable is that going to be, and to what extent does that account for all types of eventualities that might force a state to use force? When will collective security work? Right, there are some conditions according to Meir Samir which must exist if collective security is to work. The first one is that states must differentiate between aggressor and victim and then move against the aggressor, right? So जो collective security के अंदर force का use आ भी रहा है, जो point number 2 है इसमें, वो कब आएगा? जब you must be able to identify the aggressor and then you sort of move against or use force against the aggressor and not the victim, right? So the differentiation wala baat hai, again, this is very important, and it's not always very clear, right? It's not always black and white. Also, who differentiates is important to ask. कि कौन सा essentially is how do you recognize the aggressor and the victim, right? And who recognizes it? Is it a collective process? Or is it just one of the P5 or just the P5 collectively who decide that this is the aggressor and this is the victim, right? Because things are not always going to be that black and white. There will be some gray areas, and who sort of gets to take decisions in those gray areas is important. Second, you have to assume that all aggression is wrong, which is self-explanatory. Third, should a state with close friends be labeled an aggressor? In a collective security system, its friends are probably going to be reluctant to join the coalition against it, and this is a very important thing, right? So if states are on good terms, if there's like good bilateral relations between two states, and if the other state is found to be an aggressor under collective security, then that state would not really be happy, or that state would be reluctant to sort of move against it. So again, that's a very tricky situation where the international good as determined by collective security is not really going to be the national good, or it's not going to be equal to the national good in the long run in some cases. So again, that's a difficult thing to work through. Fourth, aa jata hai historical enmity between states. It can complicate matters, and we've seen that in so many cases, right? So during the Cold War period, we saw that between the US and Russia and the USSR. To some extent, we see it, but not to some extent, but we see it between Pakistan and India, for example. So these things, they do complicate matters. So basically, picking whose side you're on is not as easy as it might seem. Fifth, how to distribute the burden, right? So essentially, who's going to be responsible for what if collectively you are moving against the aggressor? Who's going to be responsible for providing the budget? Who's going to be responsible for providing the personnel? Who's going to be responsible for providing, let's say, the administrative bits? Who's going to be responsible for the rebuilding and all these things? Like, how is it going to be distributed? And this has to be done in a rational, it has to be done in an equitable, and it has to be done in a fair manner. And again, that requires a lot of planning ahead. Guaranteed rapid response is difficult, right? Because even when during the first point we discussed here, you don't just need to differentiate between aggressor and victim, but you also need to understand कि कौन differentiate कर रहा है. So the who is also important. And just like the process of this differentiation, just the process of labeling one party as the aggressor and the other party as the victim, it can be very, very time consuming. And if it is time consuming, that means that rapid response is not really going to be guaranteed. Now the seventh point says that collective security effectively transforms every local conflict into an international conflict. This is very important, right? So essentially, the collective security के तहत the international body decides that they are going to move against the aggressor. Effectively, the decision also means that a local conflict is being turned into an international conflict, and that has its own effect, that has its own impact, right? Think about what impacts there might be. So we'll flag this for Wednesday because this is an interesting one. 8th, state sovereignty. Again, that's self-explanatory कि collective security में आप ठीक है आप चढ़ें. So again, state sovereignty is going to be harmed, and how do you work around that? How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the repercussions, basically? And then the 9th one is a bit of a paradox, right? So responsible states, we're assuming they are repelled by the idea of war, right? So they are repelled by the idea of using violence or using force to forward their own, or to forward a certain doctrine. But will they go to war to stop aggression? Well, that's again, like, it's a bit of an existential question, right? So I'll flag this for Wednesday as well because this is also interesting. So responsible states, we assume they're responsible because they're repelled by the idea of war, but then if they're repelled by the idea of war and then if they go to war against an aggressor, how do they process that? How do we process that? So think about points number 7 and 9 in particular. The global governance now. एक और paradox क्या था? The collective issues we must grapple with, they're increasingly global, and yet the means of addressing these are national and local, weak and incomplete. This is from David Held, who, if you remember some of the earlier weeks, I think this was before the midterm, so before week 9 essentially, so weeks 1 to 8. At some point we discussed cosmopolitanism in detail, and so Held was one of the foremost or the primary readings under cosmopolitanism and globalization. So again, global governance की तरफ अगर हम आएँ तो one main paradox that Held puts forward is that the collective issues that we must face or we must deal with, they are global, but the means of addressing these are national and local, weak and incomplete, right? So a primary example right now would be the coronavirus or the COVID-19 situation, right? It is a pandemic, but the means of addressing these are essentially national and local, and they're weak and incomplete, and they are different, they're unequal between developed and developing countries, and even not so unequal, to be honest, because not all economies are going to be able to deal with the impact of the virus in a similar manner. Not all economies are going to be able to recover in a similar manner, right? So again, the problem is global, but the means to solve it are local, and they're also not all the same. Now, the other point I wanted to make was there's this interview with David Held again, where he's talking about structural global vulnerability, right, as a feature of our times. And he's basically, in this part, he's explaining what structural global vulnerability is. So I'll just read this out because this is very interesting. The striking thing about a world of increasing interconnectedness is that it is also a much more vulnerable world. In my writings, I refer to it as a system of global structural vulnerability. The same system that created enormous opportunities for Asia and China, it also produced this huge vulnerability of interconnectedness because there is no global management system. Given that there exists both opportunity and vulnerability, I never considered the emergence of increasing global integration as a synonym for global stability. Rather, I saw it as a new world that required a new kind of politics. Now, this last part is very, very important. अक्सर when we look at global integration, right, we somehow we tend to equate it with global stability, but Held here is making the point that it is not a synonym for global stability. Global integration or higher globalization, it does not necessarily mean global stability, but it is instead a new world order that requires a new kind of politics. You cannot continue to exist in the globalized world using the same politics of, let's say, the 70s or the 80s, right? So a new kind of politics is required, but then also what does this new kind of politics entail, right? So that's also another thing we need to consider. Now, what is structural global vulnerability or global structural vulnerability? It basically says that the system that created a lot of opportunities, it also produced huge vulnerabilities of interconnectedness, right? Because there is no global management system. And it's true, even though we have global or international organizations, but as in our discussion on Wednesday last week, someone pointed out that who is the UN accountable to, essentially. And then that is a very important question, because who's managing these international organizations at a very very broad level, right? So you need to keep going up. जब हमने एक दफ़ा turtles all the way down की बात की, I think you also need to keep going turtles all the way up in a sense, to figure out कि global management system आपका exist as such नहीं करता, and what do you do in its absence is another problem. So 3 core sets of problems जो हैं वो हेल्ड ने अपनी मीटिंग में आइडेंटिफाई किए हैं. एक प्रॉब्लम है कि शेयरिंग आवर प्लानट, राइट? सो वी आर in this system, we're not just it's not just, the world does not revolve around me, for example, but I have to share the planet, I have to share my space, I have to share the planet with other beings, I have to share the planet with other species as well. So एक problem ये है, how do we do that? Second is sustaining our humanity, which again is self-explanatory. And the third is developing a rule book जो कि directly इसकी तरफ point करता है, global management systems की तरफ. So 3 core sets of problems that we need to figure out in at least the world of 2010, which is when Held was writing. Sharing our planet, sustaining our humanity, and developing a rule book. He also recognizes 4 problems related to problem solving at the global level, right? There is a division of labor between overlapping international governmental agencies. Functions often overlap, mandates frequently conflict, and aims and objectives too often get blurred. And we've seen that in the UN as well, right? The UN के हमने organs वगैरह जब हम देखें, if you remember the very first lecture, I think. तो a lot of the times things that the UNDP is doing वही चीज़ें UNEP भी कर रहा होगा, so there is a lot of overlapping, and that means the objectives, they can easily get blurred or even put to the background, or even in some cases objectives can be dictated by the spirit of the time as opposed to being more ground up. So that's one problem. Second is the inertia in the international governmental agencies and disagreement over means, objectives, and costs. Again, inertia किस लिए आ गया? क्योंकि this is as an institution, international agencies, they can suffer from path dependency, which means that there is going to be a lot of inertia. They're going to be very resistant to change. They're going to be resistant to trying out new things, and that's not necessarily because they don't want to, but because they're also risk averse in a way. And so risk aversion is something that I would add here. Because of such increased scrutiny, on the one hand you do need global management, but on the other hand, because we don't have a global management system, which means जो scrutiny या जो scrutiny essentially है वो काफ़ी thinly spread out है, which also means that a lot of these agencies, they don't want to be held accountable for anything that goes wrong, so they try to take on things, or they try to take on processes or projects that are less risky. The third is fundamental lack of ownership of global problems at the global level, right? So ये पीछे वाले ही slide में जो हमने discuss किया था कि the problems are increasingly global, but the means of addressing these are national and local, and they're also unequal at times. So there is a lack of ownership of global problems at the global level. That's a big problem. And then fourth, accountability deficit, which is something that's come up a lot in our discussions as well. So, and that it's a real problem. Next is social democratic globalization is something that Held argues for. So we look at what social democratic globalization is. Now, before that, he maintains that the Washington Consensus and the Washington Security Agenda have failed. Right? Washington Consensus क्यों fail हुआ है? Because he argues that economic freedom is championed at the expense of social justice and environmental sustainability, with long-term damage to both. This has somewhat changed in recent years, but overall it is true, right? And the Washington security agenda has also failed according to Held. Do you think he's right? Or do you think this is debatable? So this is again being flagged for Wednesday. Now, these two, the Washington Consensus and the Washington Security Agenda, they have to be replaced according to Held by a policy framework that he calls social democratic globalization and a human security agenda. Human security agenda is something that's been gaining momentum in recent years. So the agenda basically that he presents, it has 5 major points. The first is it encourages and sustains the enormous enhancement of productivity and wealth that the global market and contemporary technology make possible, right? So it essentially it calls for like equality in terms of the benefits that can be reaped from technological advances and all that. Second, it addresses the extremes of poverty. So this agenda, it has to address the extremes of poverty, which sort of goes towards participatory peace a little bit as well, right? So you need to build peace from the ground up in order to have sustainable peace. Third is create avenues of voice, deliberation, and democratic decision making. So avenues of voice is, I think, very, very important here. So you basically need platforms, or you need spaces where everyone's voice essentially or theoretically is shareable. The fourth one is it puts environmental sustainability at the center of global governance. Now, some progress was made towards this end with the Paris Treaty, but then it's also received a setback as the US pulled out. But essentially, work has been done towards this end. And finally, it provides international security because that's the overall objective in one way, right? But provides international security essentially by way of providing points 1 through 4. So then we come to the developing world or the global south. What about the developing world? Among all this talk of how global governance systems should be reformed in accordance with globalization, what can we say about the position that is occupied, or position that should be occupied by the developing world or the third world or the global south? Mainly the third world is locked in a disadvantaged position. And again, one of the response paper prompts was about, do you think that they're going to remain locked in this disadvantaged position? So I think you should think about that question. Having a seat at the negotiating table, according to Held, at a major international governmental organization or at a major conference does not ensure effective representation. He's basically asking representation kya hai? Is representation equal to having a seat at these major conferences or at these major organizations? That might not necessarily be effective, and that might not necessarily translate into your voice or the voice of the developing world being heard. Because even when there is a parity of or equality of formal representation, it is often the case that developed countries, they have large delegations equipped with extensive negotiating and technical expertise, whereas poorer nations or developing countries, they won't really have this expertise, right? So they'll have to rely on the sharing of a delegate, or they have to rely on building communities essentially, or building rapport and doing that kind of stuff, right? So expertise matters a lot on these negotiation tables if your voice is to be heard and if your voice is to have a major impact, and that's something that the developing world lacks. Now Ayub is another reading that was probably assigned. The International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, which is the ICISS, it emphasized the central role of the Security Council on issues of humanitarian intervention, right? And it concluded that it is unconscionable that one veto can override the rest of humanity in matters of grave humanitarian concern. So this is talking about the power of the P5 and the veto power. Essentially, that translates into them overriding one of the 5, overriding the rest of humanity in matters of grave humanitarian concern. Particular concern is the possibility that needed action will be held hostage to unrelated concerns of one or more of the permanent members. a situation that has too frequently occurred in the past, right? So this is also a very interesting thing to keep in mind, right? When we think about the future of the UN, that essentially if you can't change the P5 membership, if you can't change the veto power, who holds the veto power, then the rest of the humanity is essentially going to be held hostage to the P5's whims in some ways, and just to the P5's agenda overall. And what is the third world perspective? There isn't one perspective that can fit all of the third world, right? So we have to firstly understand that there is a diversity of perspectives. Some commonalities, they do still exist, as Ayub has pointed out. First, three basically point out to me. The first is there's a generally suspicious orientation toward humanitarian intervention forms, which is forming the starting point for most third world states' evaluation of cases of international administration. So there is an increasing level of suspicion towards humanitarian interventions, which sort of calls into question the international administration of these humanitarian interventions. Secondly, there is no single third world perspective on either humanitarian intervention or international administration. Right, so again, the first point should be taken with a pinch of salt, because you can't say there's like a singular view on international humanitarian intervention. Thirdly, the selectivity demonstrated in the choice of cases both for humanitarian intervention and the installation of international administration has had major impact. On the one hand, it has added to third world suspicions, while on the other hand, it's encouraged several third world states to push for intervention in certain cases and oppose it in others, right? So it all boils down to humanitarian intervention and international administration. अभी हमने जो case studies भी discuss की हैं, उसमें humanitarian intervention in a lot of cases was not something that was in the initial mandate of these peace operations, but वो आहिस्ता आहिस्ता build हुआ था. It was something that the personnel on ground, they felt that we need like a humanitarian intervention to be included in this mandate. And again, there's also budgetary constraints when it comes to humanitarian intervention, and also humanitarian intervention can sometimes also be used as a front for fulfilling certain other ulterior motives. So again, that's why suspicions are raised from the third world perspective towards these interventions. And in some case, the third world, it might also just call for humanitarian intervention in certain cases, and that adds to the question of dependency, and adds to the question of them being locked in the system of dependency on the center. Double standards and fears. So you also points out that many third world countries, they feel that the inevitable occurrence of violence that accompanies the process of consolidating state power could leave them open to the charge of human rights violation and launch them on the slippery slope to external intervention and international tutelage. Again, ये dependency की तरफ भी point कर रहा है, but then the other thing is कि the consolidation of state power, right? इसमें basically Ayub is assuming, or he's recognizing, that the consolidation of state power is not always a very peaceful process. It can have certain levels of violence that accompany this consolidation, which means that because there's so much international scrutiny, they could be charged with human rights violation, and if they are charged with human rights violation, then action could be taken against them, which would mean that उनका जो भी consolidation, if there was a move towards peace or move towards stability in that state, वो derail भी हो सकती है. Again, that's like a very interesting way to consider this, right? So let's flag this for Wednesday as well. Double standards and selectivity from the North, right? So he also calls out the North on its double standards. Security Council resolutions condemning or criticizing Israel have been passed under Chapter 6 of the UN Charter. एक key example cite किया, right? कि जो resolutions हैं Security Council की condemning Israel for their actions, they've been passed under Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, which means that they're very different from the resolutions against Iraq, for example, which were passed under Chapter 7 and are therefore self-enforcing, right? So उसमें use of force वाला issue आ जाता है. Chapter 6, as we know, is one that does not call for use of force, but Chapter 7 is one जहाँ पर use of force is sort of recognized. So that points out the double standards that are used by the Security Council. अगेन वो जो हमने शुरू में क्वेश्चन किया था कि हु डिसाइड्स कि अग्रेसर कौन है और विक्टिम कौन है, वो चीज़ इसमें आ जाती है. Then we come to another question which we've been discussing now and again over the course of the last couple of weeks. Has the UN been successful overall? Now before we answer this question, we return to the idea that there are 3 UNs. There's a UN of governments, there's a UN of staff members, and then there's a UN of third UN, जिसको NGOs, experts and consultants और civil society वगैरह occupy करते हैं. Now each UN has to be evaluated separately. That is one thing that needs to be considered. Because if we say overall the UN has been unsuccessful, for example, then we'd be saying that all 3 UNs have been unsuccessful, and that might be uncalled for, that might not be sufficiently supported by evidence. But if we break it down, then we might be able to give a more insightful answer to one of the response paper questions. Innovations have definitely occurred in the UN. This is something that we cannot deny, which shows that the UN is responsive to external requirements of an evolving world. Even though kabhi right, it might be slow to respond, but it does respond to the requirements of an evolving world. Just now peacekeeping एक बहुत major example आ जाता है. Whether or not these innovations are entirely successful is a different story, but the innovations, they do occur. Idea development is another area जहाँ पर UN has played a key role. इसमें sustainability का एक idea आता है where the UN has played a key role. State security से human security तक आने में, for example, is a major idea development that the UN has more or less participated or spearheaded in. Developing ideas is an important way in which the UN has made a difference, but ideas alone, they're not sufficient. They're not sufficient to bring stability or peace or permanent or sustainable peace, right? Some ideas took hold and others did not. So you also have to consider that sustainability wala idea was something that took hold, then what were other ideas that did not take hold, right? That's also important to evaluate. The UN itself sometimes implemented ideas and sometimes buried them. So again, what ideas were buried is important to investigate. The UN also has constraints, as we've also discussed. The role in actual enforcement remains tightly constrained by states, right? Because again, state sovereignty is something that is still upheld. One of the main tactics used in the face of these constraints, has been to embarrass those who do not comply, right? So naming and shaming wala kaam jo hai is something that has been used quite often to sort of have certain states comply. Even if there is consensus on some type of enforcement, it may be for a relatively brief period of time, and member states may not back up that commitment with sufficient resources to ensure success. So again, the budgeting issue is a major constraint for the UN, because even when there is agreement on the type of enforcement required for a certain case, uski jo longevity is not really guaranteed, right? So that's another issue. With sanctions, the possibility of cheating is always present, and the longer the sanctions are in place, the greater the possibility of leakage. So basically, agar aap naming and shaming, so one way to hold states accountable is to threaten them with sanctions, but then again, sanctions jab lag jati hain, the longer the sanctions are in place, the possibility of cheating is always going to be present, and the longer these sanctions stay in place, there's also possibility of leakage, which means that the sanctions are not always going to be effective. So that's another constraint for the UN, but the best the UN can do in a lot of cases is impose sanctions, but the problem is that they're not always going to be successful. They're not always going to achieve the objective that was intended. So how do we measure the UN success? Mengst and Kahns, in their reading, they present a criteria जिसमें 3 main points हैं. If the UN's actions reflect consensus among member states and have financial backing from key donor states or private foundations, then it has a greater likelihood of success, right? So ये conditions थोड़ी से अगर वो fulfill करते हैं उनके actions, तो फिर there's going to be a stronger likelihood for success. क्या इनमें conditions हैं कि एक तो there has to be consensus among member states, financial backing is required, then you can sort of say that there's a good likelihood for success. If the relevant UN program or agency takes full responsibility, then yes, there is a greater likelihood for success. But do you think taking responsibility is enough for ensuring success? Because I'm not entirely convinced by this second point. The third point is that endorsement and support of professionals, outside experts, scholars, NGOs, जो essentially third UN आप कह लें, it will increase the probability, right? So essentially why? Because अगर आप outside experts वगैरह को involve करें तो फिर they're going to help build a very strong evidence base for the UN's actions. And right now, the more action that is taken on a strong evidence base, the stronger the likelihood for it being successful, or for at least for it being planned efficiently there is. Any other measures that you can think of for measuring UN success, or conditions that you think are important for measuring the UN success? You can point those out in your response papers, or you can point those out in our discussion on Wednesday. Now finally, here's one article that I want you to read before we have our class on Wednesday. And this is about the impact of COVID-19 on peace operations, the UN peace operations. And I think it's pretty comprehensive in terms of what can be expected, what the impact is, because as we know, even right now, the peace operations, they are thinking about budget cuts and whatnot, just in terms of reorganizing in the face of COVID-19. So we'll discuss this further on Wednesday. That was it for today, and I think this was the last lecture, so I'll see you all on Wednesday, and we'll discuss what we're doing in week 17 on Wednesday. Thank you.